Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Crisco from the Department of History. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank the Department of History, the Institute for Military History, the Security Studies Program, and the Department of Political Science for sponsoring this event. And would like to welcome our speakers to this looking at the Ukraine-Russia war 1 year on. We have General and former Kansas State University President, General Richard Myers, a 1965 alum of KSU, went through Air Force ROTC, 14th President of Kansas State University from 2016 to 2022. In between those two milestones, he served in Vietnam, happened to be the 15th Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President George Bush, and has, I'm sure, some excellent insights into all of this. We have Andrew Orr, Associate Professor of European Military History and Security Studies at Kansas State University. He's also the Associate Director of the Security Studies Program, the Co-Director of the Institute for Military History, and he's published on a wide array of topics in military history and in other areas of history, and that includes his recent Winning by Outlasting, the United States and Ukrainian Resistance to Russia, co-authored with Mark DeVore and published in last summer's edition of Military Review. We have Vera Smirnova, an assistant professor of geography, who after leaving Russia in 2012, earned her PhD at Virginia Tech before landing here at KSU. She describes her work as falling at the intersection of political geography, urban and terrestrial politics, and explores relations between land and power and their various manifestations in pre- and post-Soviet Russia. Sounds a little bit relevant to the topic we'll be discussing today. And so with that, I think I will hand it over to General Myers, and it's good to see you, General Myers.
Well, it's good to see a lot of you. Thank you for the introduction, Mike and Andrew, and Vera. Nice to be with you. I think, again, we've done this before, about a year ago. Too bad we don't have that tape so we can figure out what we said then and compare it to now. Somebody probably has that, but as we evaluate the war 1 year later. And I thank you all for putting this together. And I particularly thank you for letting me be part of it, to at least come back to campus virtually for a few minutes. So my topic is the sort of the military situation. And I apologize to the other panelists if I veer off into subjects which I'm a lot less competent to talk about. But it's hard to discuss the current situation without veering off into lots of different directions, but I'm going to do my best, and then I'll be quiet. So 1 year later, we all know what happened last spring. Russia made a great advance, was trying to take Kyiv. They did that with the army, they did it with air, but it was all repelled by the Ukrainian forces, and they were eventually pushed back to an area along the Russian border, and now fighting more of an artillery duel than they did in the early stages. But with all that, relatively little territory has and is changing hands at this point. Russia is currently on, I think, what we'd call a counteroffensive, expending huge resources trying to recapture parts of the area along the border that they either lost to Ukraine or is in danger of being lost. I think one way to look at this is just look at the two militaries, and I'll try to contrast them. I'll do my best to do that. First, let's look at Ukraine. They've suffered tens of thousands of casualties. Most of those have been civilian. A lot of their infrastructure has been devastated. Morale, though, and determination is as high as ever. And the West's support so far has been strong in giving them the equipment and the training they need, especially tanks and APCs recently approved to carry on their counteroffensive or their offensive. I would only note here that the U.S. National Guard training that was started under President Obama when Russia made the early forays into Ukraine really paid off, I think, for Ukraine. The training was terrific. I'm sure it had a lot to do with developing Ukraine's non-commissioned officer corps, which is the middle management of of a military, something that Russia does not have. They famously have generals and privates. It's a little more complex than that, but that's about what it boils down to. And they don't rely on non-commissioned officers like we do, and like I think Ukraine was taught to do. U.S. and other nations have given Ukraine great real-time intelligence, and this is really important from the start of this war, especially when it comes to targeting Russian areas that they want to take out. My guess is that the real-time intelligence that other nations, Western nations, are giving Ukraine is much better than anything Russia has on the battlefield. And it's obvious because of all this, Ukraine is much better at the tactical fight. And so they're in small unit tactical fights now, and they seem to be able to do really well in that environment. Of course, there's always a but to all this. So Ukraine is going to be constrained in the future. A big constraint will be that the West will not tolerate Ukraine hitting Russian territory. If they were to do so, the West would pull out immediately and stop their support immediately. They're not prepared for a brigade level conflict. Like I said, they're doing relatively small unit tactics at this point, a battalion and down, but a brigade unit, if they were going to make some huge, offensive in the Crimea or whatever, they'd need to coordinate a much bigger group of folks, and I don't think they're prepared for that. Is my take on it all. And then, of course, for Ukraine, the question is, how long will the West continue to support them? That's a big question mark. For now, it looks very solid, particularly after what's just happened in the last couple of weeks, but it looks very, 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 very solid. Now let's turn to Russia. Russia, on the other hand, didn't lose tens of thousands. They lost hundreds of thousands in casualties, both killed and wounded. They've lost, the accounts vary, but about 800,000 young men that just left the country and aren't going to be available for conscription. Their morale and motivation, as contrasted to the Ukrainians, is low. They're also burning through equipment at a very fast pace. Estimates are they've lost over 1,000 tanks and armored personnel carriers here in the first part of this last year, which then means they're going to have low ammunition levels as they go forward too, and they've not had any access to really high tech equipment that isn't of Russian design. And we talked a little bit about their leadership. I think it's inferior to Ukraine's on the battlefield for sure. They lack that NCO cadre, the non-commissioned officer cadre. And Russia never achieved air superiority over Ukraine. They tried that when they first went in, but surface-to-air missiles, defense systems kept that from happening. They still have a huge Air Force, a very competent Air Force. Whether they'll try that again at some point, I don't know. But for now, it doesn't look like they can easily obtain air superiority over Ukraine. So where does this leave us? Of course, the big question is, where's the conflict going to be going here in the coming weeks, months, or years? As someone said, wars end by one side being victorious or by negotiation. I personally see it very difficult to see one side in this conflict being victorious. You probably all know better than I do. Sorry for the dog. Sounds like we're running a kennel here. We are not. Well, they decided to speak up. They will be shot here shortly and be quiet. No, they're going to go outside, I think. But the 3-in-1 rule, where it takes 3 times as many troops to go on the offensive as it does to be on the defense. You can do it with 1/3 the number of troops. And so, it's hard to envision the troop ratios getting really so far out of balance that one side would have a huge advantage to go on the offense. Additionally, Russia under Putin, I think, will always see itself at war with Ukraine, no matter how this war ends. Even in negotiation, there'll always be that hanging over. I think Ukraine, if Putin's still in power, is still going to be in his mind something that has to be settled. And Zelensky, on the other hand, is been pretty resolute in terms of any negotiations going to have to take Ukrainian borders back to pre-Russian invasion, and that could, in some cases, go all the way back to Crimea. So you have two strategies, two strategic visions of two leaders that aren't consistent with going to the negotiating table anytime soon. So how will it end? I don't have the answer to that, and I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure nobody has the answer to that because, for starters, wars are very unpredictable. Leadership and decision making is a complex human endeavor, always hard to divine how that might turn out, and there are just too many variables in this equation. And I'm sure they'll be talked about. But is China going to come on side with Russia? Is the West going to continue to support Ukraine? All these sorts of things are in this equation, many more things in this equation that just makes it really too difficult to solve. Here's my guess. My guess would be a year from now, we're going to be discussing this same subject, albeit with Ukraine with maybe a little bit more territory than they have today, but that will generally have a stalemate. There's everything sort of points to a stalemate. I think one of the things that would be interesting to get to as the panel goes on that I don't have the answer to, but they may have some insight, is it'd be interesting to get a view of who benefits more from an extended stalemate with the continued bloodshed on both sides. It might tell us who would be first to the negotiating table if there was some insight on how each side might benefit or react to this extended stalemate. So I think I'll stop there. I see it as status quo for a while longer, and at least from the insight we have right now. And it's hard to pick anybody that could take this to conclusion in my mind. So it seems like it's going to have to be negotiated, and what's going to be the forcing function on that. So thank you all, and I'll stand by for questions later on.
Last year, when we met to talk about this, as if someone had outlined the current situation as of today and said, how would the two sides view this outcome? The answer would be that the Ukrainian government would view the current status quo as a tremendous strategic success. A year ago, the question was, will there be a Ukraine in 3 months, in 6 months? The Ukrainian army answered that in the streets of Bucha when they turned back the pincer movement around Kiev. Ukrainian regular army, Ukrainian territorial defense, and defense volunteers, they answered it. They stopped the main movement of the Russian army. Now, that's a long way from ending the war and throwing Russia out of the whole country. But it's important to bear in mind that Russia's strategic objective failed, and at this point, it's extremely hard to see how they could achieve the things for which they went to war. If war is an extension of politics, the policy they went to war for has failed, and that's huge. So there are, I think, in retrospect, a series of reasons for it, some of which were obvious at the time. It was clear even before the invasion that the Ukrainian population had made up its mind to fight. You don't have tens of thousands of people showing up in city squares making Molotov cocktails in anticipation of armored brigades showing up if they haven't resolved to make a fight of it. Now, the willingness of people to fight and their ability to win can be very different things. But the Russians seem to have assumed that much of the population would join them, or actively or passively. And from the moment of the invasion, that appeared to, that's proven to be a very poor gamble. In order to get to this point of relative stalemate, a number of things had to happen, and which were not necessarily foreseeable, at least by most. There were a few people who did, but not by most a year ago. First is the failure of the Russians to obtain air superiority, as General Myers was saying, is remarkable. I mean, they started out the war with bases on 3 sides of Ukraine, which is a difficult position for Ukraine to defend. And they had a technological advantage over the Ukrainian Air Force, and by most indications, a training advantage in how long the experience of Ukrainian versus Russian pilots. The inability to gain air superiority had a dramatic effect on the early parts of this war. There are only a handful of bridges over the Dnipro River that bisects Ukraine. The fact that they remained open transformed Ukraine's strategic situation. And it allowed them to do things like get all those Western supplies to the Donbass front on a timely manner. In an operation, you know, if Ukraine's opponent was not Russia but the United States, they would have been shocked if those bridges had survived the opening round of air attacks by the US Air Force, or really any Western Air Force. The Russian failure to be able to take out the road and rail net, which have a fairly small number of choke points in the middle of the country, really bought the Ukrainians the time to do a lot of the things they did later. And it's something that I at least did not expect that the Ukrainians would be able to defend that infrastructure at the beginning of. The other thing that happened is that the nature of the two combatants has changed. A year ago, it was Russia versus Ukraine with a certain amount of Western help. So the US government and a number of its allies had been willing to ship large amounts of light tactical weaponry. They were willing to give a lot of Javelin missiles, a lot of man-portable anti-aircraft missiles, but fairly low-level weaponry in the grand scheme of things. And they were willing to do that up to the moment of the war, and then proved willing to keep going. But that wouldn't have kept Ukraine in the fight this long, because Russia's other great advantage was scale. A much larger regular armed force, a large, somewhat sort of trained, it turns out, reserve, a large stock of equipment, and some of which appears to have been maintained, some of it, and a larger supply of munitions. At the beginning, back in March and April, Western governments were willing to ship surplus Soviet-era munitions from Eastern European, former Warsaw Pact stockpiles, still old Soviet allies that had joined NATO after the Cold War. The US was willing to back that, but wasn't really interested in going much further for a long time. By midsummer, that initial support strategy, which had helped keep the Ukrainian army supplied in the field, was running about on empty. Poland had a lot of Russian artillery shells still at the beginning of the Ukraine war, but by summer, NATO inventories of that stuff was running out. Ukraine, its friends and allies were literally searching the world for Soviet weapon stockpiles in places like Egypt, Iraq, trying to get in, see if India had anything it was willing to part with. People were looking at African army stockpiles. When you start looking up what's in Mali's military reserve, you're reaching the bottom of great power barrels there for the ability to find supplies. If the West had stood by its initial support policy, the Ukrainian army would have collapsed during the summer. It would have run out of munitions to keep fighting. They've exhausted their own supplies. They have a production capacity, but it's not enough to meet the needs of modern war. As always happens in war, logistical needs exceed pre-war estimates. That's by a growing factor the longer the war goes on. Part of the reason you've seen a shift in Western support was that by midsummer, Western leaders had to decide. Do you either walk away and let Russia win? Do you force Ukraine to try to force Ukraine to make concessions? Or do you increase support to begin substituting weapons that can draw on American and Western European stockpiles? And that was a big moment in the Biden administration, where at the beginning of the war, they had been willing to provide support for heavier weapons, but only through third-party intermediaries, as things where you could pretend America wasn't organizing anything to help Ukraine and behind the scenes. And that pretense got pretty tissue thin by the end of April, but it was still American policy. The shift in summer is critical to what Ukraine accomplished in the fall. You start having first Western artillery systems, excellent stuff coming in from German arms makers, American stockpiles, things that have a lot of NATO countries that have munitions in reserve. So you could share out the burden of supply. This changed some of the tactical situation for the Ukrainian army. Through midsummer, they were having to give ground slowly and with great, tremendous resistance, but they kept having to give ground because the Russians had artillery superiority. So the Ukrainians kept having to decide, do we hold this position at the cost of bleeding out our infantry, or do we abandon it to the Russians? They fairly consistently decided they would stand long enough to bloody the Russians, make them pay a price, and then they would conserve their forces. The Russians consistently chose to expend their infantry to take these positions at the cost of inhibiting future force generation from the level of casualties they took. But the Ukrainians kept choosing to step back and spare their forces the full effects of artillery superiority. That starts changing in the early fall, where the Ukrainians, with access to German, American, British-made artillery, and they're getting it, some from America, from Britain, they're getting stuff from Poland, the Baltics are giving them just about everything the Baltic states can find to transfer to Ukraine. And Finland, Sweden, even before they petitioned to join NATO, we're doing remarkable things to support the Ukrainians. Whole series of countries who believe the defense of their capitals begins in eastern Ukraine. And that artillery changed the nature of the battlefront. The Ukrainians have first achieved range parity, and then with more advanced rocket systems, range superiority, which was critical to the collapse of the Russian army at Izium, and ultimately forced the Russians to abandon Kherson just weeks after Putin declared it annexed as a permanent part of Russia now and forever. That episode alone shows us there's a gap between what the high command in Moscow believes is happening and what's going on the battlefield. You don't declare Kherson as Russian for time immemorial, and then 6 weeks later have to abandon the place because you can't hold the logistics across the Dnipro. If the high command understands how bad it is at the front. So what's happened, and really since summer to now, is that the nature of Russia's enemy transformed. They signed up for a war against Ukraine that would be over before major Western assistance was supposed to be able to make a difference. The Ukrainians took those first two punches They had to take two, one at Kiev and one in the south. But when they took them both and were still standing, and economically, industrially, Ukraine is now able to call upon the financial and productive resources of Western Europe and the United States, which means a lot of the advantages of equipment and scale that Russia had at the beginning that would have made a long war predictably likely to end in a Russian success went away. Going forward, if General Myers doesn't know how this ends, the professor of history doesn't know how this ends. We're really good at explaining what happened and 40 or 50 years ago. There are a lot of paths this could go. There are ways for Russia to win. I don't think there are many likely ways for Russia to achieve the objectives in the war, but there are certainly ways for Russia to make, to create a stalemate, forcing Ukraine to accept eventually some sort of ceasefire in place that leaves Russia in control of territories that compromised Ukraine's long-term security, which would be what a ceasefire in place right now did. It would deny Ukraine the ability to use the Dnipro River for commerce. It would deny them all but two of their major ports as effective forms of commerce. But for the Russians, they have some other problems. I'll leave it to my colleague to talk about domestic. But there are military scenarios in the past that look a little like this one. And I'll outline one that would be that the Russians should be worried about. The Greco-Turkish War of 1920 to 22. It looks a lot like this. The Greeks had a larger, better prepared army. They get deep inside Turkish territory to the gates of the capital, and they stall. And for about a year, the two sides pound away at each other with an unhappy population behind the Greeks as Turkish power grows with support from a number of allies, the Soviet Union, also France and Italy. And when the Turks are ready to hit back, they don't have overwhelming superiority, but the Greek army had become so demoralized with the war of attrition and inability to generate new forces that when they got a short, sharp defeat at the Second Battle of Sicaria, the army just disintegrated from its internal demoralization and logistical problems. And you end up with the Greek army fleeing in a mass to the coast to be evacuated mainly by the American Red Cross and Hoover's Near East Relief is paying for it. I'm not saying that is destined for the Russian army, but there are some parallels enough that the Russian high command should be worried about the evident demoralization of their forces and the effects of the continuing logistical failures in their rear.
Well, I will take it on and won't talk about the war directly, but we'll talk about the domestic situation in Russia. Because as we all know, the Russian victory in this war is crucial for the preservation of Putin's regime, right? Without the victory, there's going to be no Putin's regime and it will crumble. And so in which direction it crumbles or it solidifies itself, it's important for us and really for global affairs, right, to see where Russia is headed. And what we know is that the war really has revealed a corrupt and poorly operated system. It was already there, right? We knew about it, and yet maybe not everybody knew about it. So it undermines Putin's own legitimacy along multiple lines. And we are seeing political change inside Russia quite rapidly unfolding along those multiple lines. And the first one, of course, is the public support. It's still strong, right? 2/3 of the Russians, 70% of the Russians do still support the special, quote unquote, special military operation. But what has been happening since September, when Putin has mobilized 300,000 men, we have seen a massive crack in the support. We have seen 700,000 people leaving Russia. We have probably all seen all the lines of cars packed with Russian men of the military age trying to get out to go to Georgia, to go to Kazakhstan. A third of my friends have left for Kazakhstan, Armenia, Turkey, and whatnot. So we are seeing this happening, but at the same time, we are seeing the exodus of not only men who are, who are supposed to be mobilized, but also people who work in IT sphere. Russia lost 10% of its IT workers, 10% that will never come back to Russia. They work from Georgia. Most of them now work for American companies. Most of them reside in Kazakhstan. Most of them are still getting paid maybe by different Russian companies, which are aware that those people have left the country and won't come back. So we have also seen together these 700,000 people leaving the country, plus IT workers. We have seen the biggest immigration wave in history, right? After 1991 and after 1917. This is the second or the third biggest wave of people just leaving Russia. So we are also seeing, yes, indeed, 70% of people support the war, but they do not understand the reasons behind this war. And Levada Center, the only independent polling organization, tells us that indeed less and less Russians each month are understanding, less and less of them have understanding of why is this war taking place. Yes, they are happy about territorial possessions. Yes, it builds up along this old imperialist syndrome that Russia has developed with, being the former Soviet Empire and the Russian Empire, this whole idea of the massive expansive space of Russia. People do support territorial annexation. And this is exactly what you do. You first annex Kherson, you celebrate the annexation all across Russian cities, right? You, I don't know, give out some tickets to go to Kherson someday in the future, and then you lose it. People get really upset. The Russians did get really upset that Russia lost Kherson. So we are seeing those divides in the public sphere, and that really suffocates the Russian society from inside. Most importantly, we are seeing the most serious crackdown on any kinds of NGOs and independent media in Russia. We talked about it last time, but now the numbers are even rougher. We have seen the new amendments to the law on foreign agents, quote unquote, which means anybody, any individual that has not only any funding, any foreign support, but also, quote unquote, foreign influence, which is extremely hard to define. It's a loose term. I mean, how do you say that somebody has been influenced by Western ideologies? Aren't we all? It opened up more room for putting more dissidents to jail. We have seen 400 different non-governmental human rights organizations shut down. 400, that's almost everything Russia has ever had. Two most important ones was the Helsinki group, the Moscow Helsinki group was liquidated a couple of months ago, I think, by the Moscow City Court, which was one of the oldest human rights organizations in Russia. And now they're ordered to leave the country. We have also seen the most important ordering the closure of the most prominent NGO called Human Rights Center Memorial. And Memorial was investigating the Stalinist repressions. Russian government was after this NGO center for a very long time, and yet finally they were able to shut it down. And not only shut it down, but also to expel it from Russia, to take away their property from Moscow, to take away any rights. We cannot work with them, we cannot cite Memorial, we cannot cite anybody who is a foreign agent, which can be any professor of history working in Russia. You cannot engage with their scholarship at all, because it will be, you will get fined, and then maybe if you do it again, you will then go to jail. But I think the third aspect along which Russian society is starting to crumble is the cracks in Russian federalist structure. And that's the one that people are still debating about whether it's going to happen or not. We have seen that the Russian minority national republics, which are autonomous Russian republics, I mean, not really, right? Some of them, like Tatarstan, used to have a president, but not anymore. That has changed. President was removed, and now they just have a general governor. But other republics, such as Buryatia, one of the most poorest republics in Russia, one of the most indigenous republics in Russia. They speak Buryat language. They don't speak Russian language. The North Caucasus region of Dagestan, another poorest region in Russia, have suffered the highest casualties in war because their men were mobilized at the largest scale possible. If you look at the map of Russia, you would see that Moscow and St. Petersburg have almost not experienced mobilization wave whatsoever to avoid descent. But Buryatia, Dagestan, in some villages in rural Buryatia, most men would leave the village. Most men leaving women and children behind. And then, of course, the dead bodies keep floating back in. So what we are seeing, some people are skeptical about the collapse of the Russian Federation, but others are actually not skeptical because they're saying there is nothing about Russian Federation that makes it a federation, a true federation. Most of those regions are extremely dependent on the center of Moscow. Most of those regions depend, they send the taxes to Moscow, money gets distributed back into the regions. They're extremely impoverished. They're suffering from mobilization, and they're extremely remote, right? Which means at the same time it's hard to hold them attached to Moscow, but it's also very easy to lose that connection and then to see more secessionist movements and ethno-nationalist movements arise and split Russia into smaller chunks. By smaller, they're really not that small. I mean, Buryatia is quite vast, Yakutia is quite vast. More than 2/3 of Russian territory is not at all ethnic Slavs, right? So this makes the scenario even much rougher. Some people say, indeed, all empires lose their colonies, and Russia is still indeed an empire, and sooner or later, empire is going to collapse. So the cracks in the Russian federalist structure are real. So what's interesting also is that the regime support is cracking along the lines. Yes, people do support Putin, but who is to come after Putin? And there are various scenarios, and people are playing along, fantasizing who is next, who is after Putin. Will this man most likely steal more money? Will he be more corrupt or less corrupt? But one reality that is quite possible that not many of us are paying attention to is the current discontent in between the private military organization, which is Wagner, right, with Yevgeny Prigozhin being the head of Wagner, and the Russian Ministry of Defense. There is a discontent between those two groups, right? Prigozhin famously so was claiming that they are not getting enough supplies. That happened yesterday from the Ministry of Defense. And some people do see the regime change in Russia coming towards more of a heavy police state or more of a military dictatorship with Prigozhin becoming Putin. And that, I think, would be the most terrifying scenario because none of the Russians want to see this coming, right? The military dictatorship, and obviously the world would not want to see this coming too. And so many political scientists are calling for maybe the best to see some possible scenarios of regime change in Russia. Not, of course, not prescribe them because that would be absolutely wrong, but to open arms to the future, more democratic Russia, if such thing to happen, to really join the West or not. So, and that's, I think, where the danger lies, because it's a giant machinery, it's a giant beast, right, that is changing, and it's going to change either in one direction or another. And the next year or so are going to show us where it. Yes. That to me is one of the most unpredictable directions of this war that we can see.
So if anyone on Zoom wants questions, send them to everyone so I can see them on the screen I'm looking at.
There's a mouse on the lower right-hand side. Yes, absolutely.
So I don't know if my question is more for the general or more for the historian. You spoke about the change in the way the West was supporting. And then we've gone through another change, of course, with agreement with tanks. and I still haven't made a change about jets. Okay, my question is now maybe more for the general, I'm not sure, but as I understood this, I'm just a physicist, I don't know how this stuff works, but my understanding is tanks are very vulnerable if you don't have air cover, etc. So my question is how can the tanks be used to advantage if they will be maybe just vulnerable to drones or other things that you can't control the airspace above the tanks? Because that seems to me could negate the whole advantage the tanks could possibly give to Ukraine. Can someone fill me in?
You want me to go, Andrew and Vera? I'll start and they can fill in. Certainly tanks are vulnerable to aircraft right with the right armament. But as I tried to mention earlier, the Russians do not have air superiority over Ukraine. And so for them to use air to go after Ukrainian tanks would make their aircraft, the Russian aircraft, very vulnerable to the surface-to-air missiles, the air defenses that Ukraine has. And the opposite's pretty much true as well. The airspace, both sides have great air defenses. But the tank, the greatest threat to the tank is always anti-tank weapons or another tank. And here, with the systems that the West has provided to Ukraine, they've got pretty good anti-tank capability. But I think in these kind of fights that we're in right now, properly used, the tank will be a pretty decent weapon for Ukraine. And given how many Russia has lost in the first foray into Ukraine, I mentioned 1,000 armored personnel carriers and tanks. I think that providing Ukrainians, the Ukrainian army with tanks is a good move, a needed move, and I think they'll be very effective in the battle space, not having to worry so much about Russian air, but tactically trying to make the anti-tank missiles and so forth, anti-tank systems, to negate them as they take on Russian forces, Russian ground forces. So I see them as a positive. I'm told the first Polish Leopard tanks arrived today in Ukraine, so that process is going forward. I hope that helps. Maybe it wasn't complete enough, but I hope it helps.
That helped me a lot. If I could follow up, I also talked about drones. Are drones incapable of damaging the Leopard 2s? Because there's word about that's one of the weapon items that China is thinking about supplying many more weaponized drones, but are they not sort of thought of as anti-tank?
Yeah, I think drones can be anti-tank weapons. I don't know about the Chinese drones in particular. My guess is, since there's some talk about that might be a place they would be used. But I'm not that familiar with the Chinese drones and what kind of anti-tank weapons they might carry. They'd have to be pretty robust because, of course, tanks are armored for just that kind of attack. But I don't know about the Chinese drones. I know there people are talking about that and worried about what that might mean to the Ukrainians if the Chinese started supplying those to Russia. But beyond that, I don't know. I'm sorry.
All right, I got a question here on the chat. It says from Jeff Nelson, what impact do you think the Chinese announcement concerning a possible ceasefire will have on ongoing hostilities?
I'll start off saying none. I don't think that, the Chinese are positioning themselves diplomatically, possibly trying to give themselves cover to justify supplying Russia, but China has no leverage over the Ukrainians. And if they were going to put leverage on Russia, they'd be doing so quietly instead of suggesting they'll equip them and then trying to get the Russians to make concessions.
For all three of you, from the beginning, Putin rattled the nuclear saber and has a few times since then. But it seems like that rhetoric has been tamped down recently. Russians considered that option, discarded it, or are they just not discussing it? See us.
I see Andrew looking at the screen. If you want, I'll start, then you all can correct me, but well, it's very difficult to understand what a tactical nuclear weapon, which is the kind of nuclear weapons they're talking about, how they would be used effectively in this battle space we're talking about. What impact could they have? And of course, there'd be ramifications from that would impact probably both Ukraine and Russia. So there's not a lot of talk about it right now. I think another reason there's not a lot of talk is that both China and India early on said that wouldn't be a good move. So I think Russia stands to alienate all of the world, including China, who has said, we have this rock solid relationship, which I think is hyperbole, but I don't think Russia's already heading towards North Korea status in terms of the kind of state it is, or Iran. And I think this would just cement that in ways that nothing else could. So I think Putin probably puts that in his calculus somewhere, I would hope. But you can't, you don't want to alienate China. You don't want to alienate India if you're Russia, because you don't have many friends left in the world. And not saying they're friendly, but they tend to, China's certainly leaning that way. And I don't think they'd have the impact they'd have in the battle space would be, I think, probably marginal for what people are trying to achieve.
I mean, one of the reasons I think Russia has scaled back, obviously, as General Miles says, there's diplomatic consequences, but also at the very beginning, it seemed like it worked a little bit to restrain some Western support for Ukraine, but there's a point of diminishing returns. Putin rattled that saber a lot at the beginning, and when Western leaders, sometimes the Americans, especially at the beginning, the British and the Poles, called his bluff by doing things he's implied could lead to retaliation, he couldn't retaliate because it's one thing to threaten to throw nuclear weapons at a NATO power. It's another thing to do it and expect you're not starting global thermonuclear war when you do it. And the failure of those, as those failures racked up, he kind of stepped back a little bit to that. More recent, earlier this week, he withdrew from the New START agreement. But I wonder if that isn't more for domestic consumption to show to his people at home, Russia's being strong and retaliating, because it's not as if he's simply going to start producing a whole bunch of advanced nuclear weapons in the middle of this war with all the spare resources he has laying around that he's not using to produce effective conventional weapons.
It's inside Russia, it's very popular discourse, right? I mean, people start printing out bumper stickers and putting them in their cars with like nukes and stuff, but this is where it ends. I think it's just a populist advertising all over Russian state TV, but that's it. That's the end of it.
Have a from Scott McIntosh in the chat for General Myers. CGCS Milley recently reported that the Russian Air Force is not crossing into Ukraine due to Ukraine's augmented air defense capability. And as you and Dr. Orr have noted, Russia doesn't have the air superiority needed to support its ground forces in the fight. Further, the air-to-ground munitions that Air Force is launching are long-range standoff missiles. Do you believe, sir, that the West is insisting on safeguards or rules of engagement to prevent Ukraine downing a Russian aircraft over Russian territory with Western donated SAMs?
I'm sure they have been discussed a lot. And as I think anybody with any military background, you know that we all, whether you're air, sea, or land, you operate with rules of engagement that would cover things like that. And as I mentioned earlier, I think if Ukraine were to down a Russian aircraft over Russia, maybe they get by with it once, but if that started to be routine, then I think you'd find NATO, the EU, the West, the US pull back very quickly, because that could lead to a larger conflict that could involve NATO countries, and that nobody wants that. I don't think so. Could be very, very dangerous. So yes, I'm fairly confident that those kind of rules are in place, and I'm sure we're providing Ukrainian fighters with a lot of support when they're airborne, to include helping with their command and control. So my guess is that we have some input on how those intercepts go down.
It's interesting if you look at the platforms Ukraine has used, those times when it has struck outside of Ukrainian territory. Because they have hit inside of Russia at limited moments, right? And they've hit in Crimea, where the Russians at least think it's Russia. And there seems to be a kind of two-tiered system. In Crimea, the Ukrainians seem to have used, at a minimum, some weapons developed with Western help and engineering, and to be able to strike Russian air and naval bases as their bases there. But when they've hit inside of Russia itself, they've always used those indigenous weaponry. They use their own long-range cruise retrofitted cruise missiles to hit the Russian strategic air, bomber bases. They used those Soviet-era attack helicopters to hit fuel depots inside of Russia. They used domestically produced one-way drones, that the Antonov Aircraft Company in Kiev can build itself, to hit Russian oil facilities on the Sea of Azov. So when they've struck inside of Russia, they've used their own stuff. When they hit in Crimea, they sometimes can use at least Western involved things, suggesting that there's an understanding of what they can use where, and there's a bit of a sliding scale to it.
I think it's a dangerous game given the fog of war. Ukraine might know they're using their indigenous weapons or whatever without much Western or any Western support. But in the end, when the target blows up, you're asking somebody to do some pretty fine analysis to determine that that's indeed a fact. And I think it's a dangerous game. Russia could react in ways that could escalate all of this. And so I hope, certainly with the question that was asked about American missiles and so forth, I think we have to be very, very careful how we do that.
This is a question, I think, for 12 months ago, Western media outlets were reporting that Putin was emptying his prisons in order to make up for his manpower shortfalls. That story kind of evaporated, I think, or I wasn't paying attention or something. Did that happen? A. B, how did the Russian domestic population respond to it?
And C, what was the impact, if any, that we know to Russian military operations as a result of all these untrained prisoners coming into the ranks of the infantry?
Well, not only prisoners that are untrained, but all 300,000 mobilized men, mostly in their early 20s, all of them are untrained. They only had 2 weeks to prepare, and there would be some leaked video, going into, they would be buying some things off eBay because they just couldn't stop the army. They would have to buy their clothes off eBay, and it would be such really sad. But the prison situation is indeed very real, and Prigozhin himself, the head of the Wagner group, traveled prison to prison and went into my region where I have friends and colleagues, and called people to join the private group, Wagner private group, and indeed thousands of people did. Because if you come back home alive, they erase your sentence and then you just go into society. And many people already came back home alive or dead. And those who came dead would have this massive funerals that would be translated on the national television as, look, they come back as heroes. They left as prisoners and they come back as heroes. And there would be multiple people that, I don't know, kill their mother and wife and the children, and they come back and have this lavish parties thrown for their funeral. It's a very controversial topic. I'm surprised how much it's been supported in Russia, right? Yes, give them second chance to show their support for the mother Russia, and it worked, yes, and thousands of people have gone to.
I got another question from the chat from Corey Beasley. Hope I pronounced that correctly, Corey. Looks like it's for the group. When or if the war ends, how do you think the world will respond? Will there be even more sanctions against Russia or something totally different?
If the war ends,
When or if the war ends?
I mean, I don't think we're going to impose, I mean, presuming Ukraine, the war does not end with the Russian conquest of Ukraine. And I mean, I don't see kind of how that would trigger an escalation of sanctions. And presumably the war, the end of the war will see the beginning at least of an unraveling of this, of the sanction regime. It would be a difficult moment in NATO. Eastern Europe will want to maintain the cordon sanitaire against the Russians, and with permanent economic sanctions. But in Western Europe, the French and the Germans may be a lot less interested in maintaining that kind of permanent and economic separation from Russia. I think what happens at the end is just so dependent on how it ends. Is there a negotiated peace? Are the Russians have some sort of morale-induced collapse and skedaddle back to Russia?
There's one possible scenario of regime change inside Russia is totally elite-driven, right? The elites that form a very strong tight circle. Where Putin goes, the elites still stay, and so the elites have to preserve their wealth. And that is not possible if the sanctions are still imposed. So for that scenario to happen, for the elites to elect their leader that will help them to preserve their wealth, the sanctions will have to be lifted. Otherwise, we are going back into who knows what happens with Russia when Putin's gone. And for that scenario, yes, the sanctions will have to be lifted. Otherwise, the elites will start fleeing the country, and what we will have is probably again military warlords. Who knows who would accumulate money because of the war?
I think even if the war ends in a situation where both sides agree to some sort of negotiate treaty or whatever, and it plays out and Russia goes back with its military and things are kind of back to some sort of normality, I still think it's going to take years for Russia, no matter who the leader is, to build trust with the international community that it has lost over the last many years, actually, almost over a decade. And I think it's going to take time to recover from that. Most international agreements are built on initially trust just to get the negotiating table. You can't negotiate unless you trust one another. And that's been lost for a long time with Russia. So I think no matter how, if it ends sort of in a amicable way, I think there are going to be years of whatever Russian leadership comes to the fore, if they want to be part of the significant part of the international community. And you would think some Russian leadership would like to, help their people achieve all they can achieve. And that's just, the way it's going right now, that's not happening. Maybe in Moscow, but not many other places.
I think along that line of questioning, you look at the way the Russian military or the Russian people have really waged war the last year. It's a tremendous willingness to suffer, to take high casualties, to fight wars of attrition with a sacrifice. We talk about regime change and the elites. We talk about 700,000 people fleeing Russia. At what point is it possible for a popular uprising regime change within Russia, and what other conditions might have to be in play? Look at like the spring uprisings in the Middle East. It was essentially trying to crack down type situation, and there was a popular uprising that they did create regime change within a country. Do you see that happening in Russia, or what kind? No, not at all.
I really don't think so. After 2012, protests in Russia, wide protests, 100,000 people were in jail. Some of them are still in jail. I mean, Navalny is back in jail in the next 4.5 years, and probably for eternity. I don't think the popular uprising is the way out of this regime. It has failed so many times. Russians have suffered so many times. If you look at the national minority republics that I described, I mean, so many of them don't have running water. What kind of regime change led from the ground up are we even talking about? I think it's a society that is getting to be even more impoverished than it was before. And it's just, I think it's either the elites, right, the economic elites, either or warlords of some kind of Prigozhin, or other people who are already skimming and seeing where this is going, and they probably know much more than us who is the next. But definitely, I don't think so.
I got another chat question. Is Ukraine's military anticipating a change in Russia's battle tactics, or are they in a state of reacting as things happen? I'm thinking of the advent of tanks in World War I, and how much of a role that played in changing the tide of the war. For example, it seems drones have dramatically changed the way artillery is used. That question is from Luke Dempsey.
Well, I'll just start again. I just think Ukraine's done a pretty good job of reacting to the threat. And part of that's based on the really good US and Western intelligence that they have at their disposal. And they've shown, I think, great flexibility and innovation in how to deal with the threat as it developed. And so I would think that would continue. And drones are just one more issue. There'll be more that could come into play that they'll have to deal with. So I think they've done a pretty good job. I don't think they don't look reactive. They don't seem reactive to me. They seem thoughtful in how they're going to take some of these things on. Of course, the first time anything shows up, you got to react to that the best you can, but they seem to work their way through it. And I think they get a lot of help intellectually from the West in trying to figure that out as well, because a lot of these problems aren't new to other conflicts we've been in.
I add something to that. So I think one thing from an Army perspective we saw 3 to 4 months ago is there's a shift of the Russians targeting civilian infrastructure. So that's something that the Ukrainian military can counter that. So we talked about the importance of the rule of fight. I think one of the big risks for Ukraine right now is this prolongs out because people suffer more as they feel without power, without water, without food. I think that was a major shift in Russian tactics 3 to 4 months ago that I think has been a little bit understated in the news. So that fight stuff with Ukrainian people. But that definitely Russians.
All right, in the back.
This might be for you, Dr. Christo, or anyway.
Speak loudly to make sure that General Myers can shout.
Actually, you maybe Dr. Christo. We've seen a lot of social media users on the ground. Bloggers and these other groups mentioned like some of the, and provoke and the fight. How has social media changed landscape at all over the past year? How they're operating in the information space? I guess.
Let me, for the benefit of General Myers, I'll say the question was, has the social media landscape changed?
Changed inside Ukraine or changed?
Now, I'll say one thing about how this, kind of social media landscape of the war that, I think it's been surprising to a lot of people, how ineffective Russian social media based information operations have been. They acquired a really big reputation in the West, perhaps an exaggerated one for the amount of actual effect they have. They've had the knowledge of Russian operations perhaps had a bigger political impact in the US than the actual Russian operations against the US, against US elections, for instance. And so the Russians have attempted to run disinformation campaigns, a series of false flag presences online, fake Ukrainian soldiers with neo-Nazi imagery, put out by accounts with 14 followers, and spammed by 18 other accounts, all who have like 10 to 20 followers. But the thing about these kind of operations, it turns out, is that once you expect someone to be doing them, they're not that hard to detect. They're effective initially when you're not thinking about it, when you're not prepared, when people approach it in some ways naively, but approach it without expecting to come under an influence operation. Once you're thinking about, is it out there? Those Russian operations have been pretty ineffective. They're centrally driven. They're run by groups in the military and intelligence services, and now sometimes run by some of the companies owned by elites and the like, trying to push this stuff out. And it's had a little bit of impact on the very far right and the very far left, but not very much. The stuff on Ukraine's side has been more effective, in part because the Ukrainian government seems to have figured out that the best way to run an effective social media propaganda as a government is to not run it and step back and let the people who like you run it on their own, and they'll be much more believable if it's not produced by a secret front organization of the Ukrainian foreign ministry. And that kind of battle, the Russians have been, in terms of shaping public opinion, the Russians have been remarkably ineffective compared to Ukraine. What's interesting is that it's become tactical. Is that the Ukrainian government and presumably the Russians have been able to use social media accounts in order to track and do damage assessment of operations, and commanders have started to figure out to take phones away, but Russian soldiers don't seem to be very well disciplined. And so they seem to be continuing to take their own cell phones from Russia into occupied Ukraine and take videos of things, even though the Ukrainians on the other side of the line are taking
Or leaving phones behind.
Yeah, that too.
I didn't hear the question clearly, but Andrew, let me add on to what you were talking about. I think the one place where social media has been used very effectively, and that's with President Zelensky. He has done a terrific job of harnessing that to build morale and determination among the Ukrainian people and the troops, no doubt. So he gets, at least the things I read, he gets high praise for his adroit use of that capability.
All right, back to the chat from Nina Behrens. Question for anyone. Is there any evidence that the West's limited action during the 2014 annexation of Crimea emboldened Russia to take action against Ukraine, or was this war inevitable regardless of how the West addressed that situation?
But I'll start. I'll just say that I think, you know, the West kind of stood by and we didn't do much. I think that goes into the calculus of a man like Putin. And when he says, you know, what kind of ire am I going to draw if I go into Ukraine? Who's gonna come up and criticize and complain and maybe even help the Ukrainians? And I think what he saw in Crimea was just probably went into his calculus. What he saw in our Afghanistan withdrawal, what he saw with January 6th in our capital. He says the U.S. is really distracted politically, and they don't seem to be quite as effective as they used to be on the world scene. So I bet I can get by with this. That would be and I may be all wrong, but that's, I think if he's running his own numbers, he probably came out with something like that.
I think that's all of it is entirely right. I mean, and the bill for the fall of Kabul was paid by the Ukrainians in Kiev. Because it was a signal to, Putin read it as evidence that Biden was extremely risk averse, which meant Putin thought he could push policy faster than Biden would react. He read the American right out of the January incident, out of Trump's general rhetoric, to be deeply isolationist and unwilling to confront Russia. And by the time you write the Republican Party and the Democratic president off, you're not very afraid. I think he also read conflicts within the EU. And I think that was probably more important than most Americans realize. He assumed that the Germans and the French would, as they did in 2014, do next to nothing and want to negotiate their way out of it. And he also assumed that the more nationalist, sometimes quasi-authoritarian parties in Eastern Europe, which were at odds with the EU over democracy and liberalization laws and things like a free judiciary. He assumed in all of those countries, those parties would look favorably on him because he saw himself as their patron. And he, to some extent, was right about Hungary and Orban, but he badly misjudged Poland and the Polish reaction. He thought Poland would behave like Hungary. Instead, Poland behaved like Poland, and in the face of Russian forces moving. And I think he took all of this in American and European divisions, and then believed his army was more effective than it turned out to be, and figured, well, I can take the whole thing in 2 to 3 months. It'll take them that long to figure out what they're doing. They're so divided.
And it was very popular inside Russia too. The occupation of Crimea, not only among the public, but among the elites too. If none of us know much about land in Crimea, but most land in Crimea was nationalized. The land code imposed by Putin's regime in Crimea has removed all Ukrainian landowners from the Crimean land, which is all of the Crimean landowners are Ukrainian. So if they wouldn't receive a Russian passport, they would be expelled. And so expropriation of Russian land, of Ukrainian land in Crimea was on a massive scale. And now we see Russian cronies coming in and owning vast tracts of land, owning all the wineries that are old, beautiful wine producing operations that were running in Crimea for a long time. It were the pride of Ukraine for a long time. Now all owned by the Russian cronies. So privatization of land and the opening of that, and nobody saying anything about it, has definitely allowed all this mess.
There's been a lot of noise about possibly other states like Belarus and Moldova. What are the chances of that happening? How would that change the shape of the battlefield? How would that change the relationship?
There are recent discourse about Russia also formally annexing Abkhazia, North Ossetia, South Ossetia, and all those regions too. And that happened just like 5 days ago, before Putin's address to the Federal Council that happened was 3 days ago. But we haven't heard about it yet. But I'm also very curious to see how that unfolds. I don't think we know for sure.
To the effects, I think the person looming over my head is better suited to address the military effects of Belarus re-entering the conflict.
You know, I think it's hard to imagine that Belarus would see that in their best interest, and they'd have to be coerced to do something like that, in my opinion. Could it happen? I guess it could happen. I think it would do the same thing it's done before. It strengthen the resolve of NATO and the West, and I think we would support Ukraine in whatever it had to do to deal with it. And I just can't imagine their enthusiasm for something like that. But it could have an impact for sure. I mean, Ukraine's military is stretched. They're doing a great job, but it's stretched and hard to what if it. But my guess is Ukraine will get some help from places they didn't expect it.
Hey, not quite a question in the chat, just a reference to Russian soldiers posting their pictures real time.
Here,
I can't pronounce that. The
Russian version of Facebook.
okay. With their approximate location has become a bit of an advantage for Ukraine. All right.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I think in looking at the whole. Anything too soon to tell.
I'll put it this way. The Russo-American conflict is back. But this is not the Cold War. Russia is not the power that the Soviet Union was. During the Cold War, only the United States could balance Soviet power. The problem for Russia, and what China should remember from afar in all of this as it tries to profit, is that Russia has crippled itself long-term with the casualties and equipment losses it's taking. And it's revealed that it is not nearly so strong as had been feared and as Russia tried to project. If Europe follows through on a reinvigoration of its defense, the European part of NATO is more than capable of blocking any Russian advance, and then you have American power standing behind it. So, intense security competition is clearly back in Europe, but the line is far further east, and the Russians do not have anything like the kind of power that Stalin or Brezhnev could put behind that in the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s. If China's making a play thinking Russia is a long-term distraction and will keep America from being able to act in the Pacific, it may blow up in their face, because a reinvigorated Europe actually frees American power to pivot more effectively to the far east. Exposing Russian weakness may not have worked out the way Beijing is hoping it does.
All right, to the chat. Thoughts on the USG's goal manage the situation in Ukraine, United States government, in perpetuity or until a full withdrawal of Russian forces? Or is there something that has some strategic realization that has emerged as a result? Was that is USG, Scott Nelson, USG, US government? I'm assuming UKR is Ukraine. So thoughts on the US government's goal managing the situation in Ukraine in perpetuity or until a full withdrawal of Russian forces? Or has something emerged as a result, some strategic realization emerged as a result?
I'll start, Andrew, or Vera, and you guys can correct the record.
Yeah.
But I think the United States has approached this from the beginning as a strategic issue, one that has a lot to do with Western democracies and sovereignty and alliances and all that. So I don't know if it's in perpetuity, but I think the US and the West will probably be engaged in this until there's some sort of satisfactory outcome, whatever that is. And we've not been able to define that today. So I don't think anybody can define it at this point. The slugfest is going on, and the mud and the mire and the blood, and it's going to go on for a while, in my opinion. But I think the U.S. government, back to strategic planning days, has strategic interest here, and has viewed this as, in a way, an existential threat against Western democracies and world order. So I think the U.S. is going to be engaged in this for some time to come, and I think the West will be as well. Whether with the same intensity, I can't say that, but I think this is something that's just not going to fall off the table. It's gonna have to wait till there's some sort of resolution that's satisfactory.
I mean, I don't know, from the outside, I don't know exactly what the administration's goal is. But this is a little different situation than the American wars we're more used to. Because there's a level where this is the West and the US leading, resisting resisting the Russians, but this is Ukraine's war to defend itself. There's an inevitable fuzziness about Western goals because we're not the principal decision maker. We're backing somebody else's defense of their own sovereignty and freedom. And so, we can't draw up a kind of specific plan that we can expect to be easily executable. This is how we get to this, this outcome. Instead, you have to have sort of general objectives, a clear concept of what are your interests, what are the things you're out to protect, and you kind of have to manage in the median term constantly. As the situation changes, to try and keep that, try and keep American support coming in ways that meet those interests. One of which, and if one of those interests is Ukrainian sovereignty, then you have to let Kiev be in the lead in deciding what its strategy to make peace someday is. Otherwise, you defeat the whole goal of of defending defending Ukrainian sovereignty. Sadly, that means I don't have a great answer, except it's not going to end, and for the foreseeable future, because the threat is unlikely to go away, even if Ukraine wins decisively on the battlefield. Probably not the last Russo Ukrainian War.
Question for you, Vera. One of your earlier answers, I think you, in two different parts, you referenced what was going on in, I think, your home region, and also, I think, referenced communicating with friends, family, colleagues. And I'm wondering, to what extent are you able to communicate freely with friends, families, and colleagues? And is there any risks or to them for doing so, or any limitations that you censor yourself in terms of those communications?
Well, Instagram is shut down, Facebook is on the way to be shut down, YouTube is on the way to be shut down. So it's all getting shut, but there is always, some underground Telegram channels, WhatsApp, developed by different Israeli and Russian groups. So it's all there. We are still able to talk, but the question arises, do we want to go places and see your family back at home? And that's where the problem lies, right? So my family not able to come here, obviously, not being able to get a visa, be rejected 3 times to get into the EU, to go into the American embassy in Poland. So we're trying to find ways, speaking on personal notes, right, for the family to meet my newborn child and whatnot. And it's becoming extremely complicated. And so the only answer is to meet them on the separate in Turkey or in Georgia or in Armenia or elsewhere. And that's what people have chosen to do. Tons of friends that I have left for Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and whatnot. And so this is what you do. You reconnect with your family abroad. And this is the reality in today's situation, because nobody wants to go back to Russia the way it is right now. It's very sad.
Kind of looking in the future wars and how they're going to fight other doctrine being based on how the Russian fighting.
Questions for a historian.
Should I repeat that, General Myers? Did you hear the question, or should I repeat it?
I didn't hear it at all. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I think the question was, how is, I'll paraphrase, how is the U.S. doctrine being updated based on how the Russians are fighting? Or has the U.S. doctrine been updated based on the way the Russians are fighting?
So I don't know if it has, but I think one of the things that takes place at Leavenworth, not very far from where you all are, is that they constantly try to update our doctrine depending on what the enemy is doing. So I think there probably is that going on. Whether it's been done now or not, I don't know. There's some real dangers here too, right? I mean, we've seen the Russians not perform particularly well on the battlefield, but that doesn't mean on the next battlefield they won't. So I think we have to be very, very careful that we don't read too much into this. And we found out after the wall came down that the Russians weren't 10 feet tall. Now we're seeing that they have some real struggles with their ground forces, but they've got air and space and rocket forces that are still very strong. And some parts of their Navy are very strong, and we've not seen any of that. So I'm sure there's work going on to capture lessons learned from this and what we've seen. But that's kind of a continuing process in terms of the U.S. military, is just continuing to refine our TTP, our tactics, techniques, and procedures, and our doctrine.
Add to that a little bit. So within the Army, we're talking a lot about, we've talked about decentralized command. So we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had air superiority, we had comm superiority. I was a 211, I come to command 24 hours a day, and I was at. The thing now, with near peer threat, you're powering that down to 2 leaders and squad leaders having to make decisions. So it's that mission command concept of giving guidance from a higher level and allowing 22-year-old platoon leaders to make decisions on the battlefield. But they're not going to have constant comms with the higher headquarters. They have to understand the intent and execute, which is what we're seeing in the Ukrainian military. That's, I think, honestly, the sets of this military apart is we do that. We have what General Myers talked about the incident before. We're even doing that more. So we have at our CTC, we do what's called experimentation. So we send a big combat team for validation. It used to be a brigade combat team that set their headquarters up in one spot and have radios and antennas going everywhere. We're not doing that now. We're trying to decentralize so that if you have a MLRS type equivalent strike, it's to take out the entire. We're absolutely experimenting with less.
We have a question in the chat from Mike T. If the war were to end this summer with an overwhelming Ukrainian victory, not saying it's likely, do you see a quick path to NATO and EU membership, or will some of the pre-war issues with corruption and other external issues come back to the surface to prevent the Ukraine from joining? Fabulous last question, doesn't it?
I'll take a stab at take a stab at part of it. One of the things the Russian invasion has done is to really change the balance of power within the European Union. The French in particular have lost a lot of influence over EU decisions because of Macron, how kind of relatively conservative, careful Macron has tried to be. Eastern Europe has asserted itself as a political entity in the EU. I think NATO, Ukraine is unlikely to meet the NATO standards, although this is the case where the NATO standards might become politically malleable in the wake of a Ukrainian victory, and because there'd be significant pressure in Eastern Europe to bring Ukraine in, specifically because of how much other states fear that if Ukraine is left out, that will be right back here in 10 or 15 years with the Russians having another go at Ukraine and NATO trying to lean halfway in. And I question whether whether EU in the end will go for full EU membership, given the series of economic reconstruction and continuing internal political challenges in Ukraine. But I find it really hard to believe that there's not going to be some kind of substantial movement within that process in Ukraine's favor. And if the EU can't go all the way and bring in Ukraine in, which I think is probably more likely at this point that they can't, that they would then potentially probably compromise into a special economic relationship with Ukraine to try and tie Ukraine into the EU economically in a more profound way as part of helping with rebuilding and assuring Eastern European members that the door remains open for Ukraine long term, and it's not going to be left for Russia to try and pull it back into Russia on could be a third or fourth attempt. If Putin remains in power, membership in both is probably somewhat more likely than if he falls, because of just how negative trust levels in Putin are. That his survival would politically be a strong argument in some European countries to look the other way to Ukraine not meeting all the membership requirements in some of these organizations. But I don't know, it's an unpredictable political question that needs a lot of countries to come to a yes to get either one.
Somebody have added an extra point.
Scott McIntosh adds, a frozen conflict on a nation's territory is a showstopper for NATO, such as Georgia and Moldova.
It has been until you have a major war and a focused enemy again.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you to our speakers. General Myers, leave the room.
Thank all of
All
you
right.
for coming. We thank you for the fascinating and informative questions, which help us think through these issues. Both every bit as much as we try and help you.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Mike.